When a man saved an abandoned wolf cub, he never imagined the entire pack would appear at his door. Deep in the wilderness, where humans rarely venture, one photographer's decision to save a dying wolf pup triggered a chain of events that would leave wildlife experts stunned. What began as a rescue quickly evolved into something far more dangerous and extraordinary. The wolves were watching, waiting, and planning their response to the man who had taken one of their own. And when they finally made their move, nothing would ever be the same. Jack Winters wasn't like most people. After 15 years as a renowned wildlife photographer, he'd retreated to the remote wilderness of northern Montana, preferring the company of mountains and forests to humans. His cabin, nestled among towering pines, was his sanctuary, a place where he could capture the raw beauty of nature without interference. But nature had other plans that fateful November night. A violent storm tore through the mountains with apocalyptic fury. Windows rattled as wind howled like a wounded beast. At 2 a.m., Jack was jolted awake by a crash. A massive pine had fallen dangerously close to his generator. If that went out, he'd freeze before morning. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling on his coat and grabbing a flashlight. The moment he stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked him off his feet. Rain turned to sleet, stinging his face as he fought his way toward the fallen tree. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint it almost disappeared in the storm's rage. A whimper, then another. Jack froze, sweeping his flashlight across the underbrush. There, beneath a tangle of broken branches, two tiny eyes reflected the light. A wolf cub, no more than a few weeks old, lay trembling in the mud. Its gray fur was matted with blood, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle. "Where's your mother?" Jack whispered, scanning the darkness. No other wolves in sight. No tracks. Nothing. The cub whimpered again, weaker this time. Its sides barely moved with each shallow breath. Every instinct told Jack to leave it. Wild animals belonged in the wild. Interfering with nature's course was the cardinal sin of wildlife photography. Besides, where there was a cub, a protective mother couldn't be far. But as sleet turned to snow and the tiny creature's eyes began to close, Jack made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. "I must be out of my mind," he muttered, gently wrapping the cub in his jacket. Its body felt like ice, frighteningly still except for the faintest heartbeat against his palm. What Jack didn't realize was that this tiny wolf would change his life forever, in ways he could never have imagined. Back in his cabin, Jack cleared his kitchen table with one sweep of his arm. Photography equipment, notebooks, and yesterday's coffee mug clattered to the floor as he gently laid the wolf cub on a clean towel. Under the harsh kitchen light, the full extent of its injuries became clear. The cub was a male, severely malnourished, ribs protruding like cruel fingers beneath its skin. Its left hind leg was broken, though mercifully a clean break. But most concerning was its temperature, dangerously low even for a wolf. The small creature's fur was caked with mud and debris, and several patches revealed angry red skin underneath where it had been scraped raw. "Come on, little guy," Jack murmured, wrapping the cub in heated blankets. "Stay with me." He had witnessed countless struggles for survival through his camera lens, but never had he felt so personally invested in the outcome. The cub's labored breathing filled the quiet cabin with a rhythmic rasp that seemed to grow fainter by the minute. Jack had photographed wolves for years, documenting their hunting patterns, pack dynamics, and the brutal reality of their lives. But caring for one was entirely different. This wasn't capturing a moment in time. This was actively fighting against nature's verdict. He grabbed his satellite phone, his only connection to the outside world, and called the only person who might help, Dr. Elena Ramirez? It's Jack Winters. I need your help. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the urgency he felt. Elena was a wildlife veterinarian he'd worked with on a conservation project years ago. Her sleepy voice sharpened instantly when he described the situation. Jack, you need to return it to where you found it. The mother... There was no mother, Jack interrupted, pacing the worn wooden floor. No tracks, no pack. And in this storm, he'll be dead within the hour. I've been observing the local packs for months. Something must have happened. Predators, hunters, disease, I don't know. But this little one was completely alone. A long pause filled the line. Jack could almost see Elena rubbing her forehead in that way she did when faced with an ethical dilemma. You understand what you're taking on? This isn't a dog, Jack. Even at this age, it's a wild animal with instincts that will eventually surface. And, legally speaking, I know what it is, he replied, watching the cub's labored breathing. Just tell me how to keep it alive until morning. After that, I'll figure something out. Elena sighed, then switched to her professional tone. First, you need to warm him up. Gradually, not too fast. Then, hydration is critical. I'll talk you through making an emergency formula. The night became a blur of desperate measures. Warming the cub with heated rice packs wrapped in towels. Mixing a homemade formula of goat's milk, egg yolks, and a small amount of corn syrup that Elena swore would work as an emergency substitute for mother's milk. Setting the broken leg with makeshift splints fashioned from his carbon fiber camera tripod and medical tape from his first aid kit. Every hour brought new challenges. The cub refused the formula at first, turning its head away weakly. Jack tried different techniques, dropper, shallow dish, even dipping his finger in the mixture and letting the cub lick it off. Finally, desperation led to inspiration. He soaked a clean cloth in the formula and let the cub suckle on it, mimicking its natural feeding behavior. That's it, Jack encouraged, as the cub finally began to take nourishment. One step at a time. By dawn, Jack had not slept a minute. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional drip of melting snow from the eaves. But the cub's condition had worsened. Its breathing came in ragged gasps, each one seemingly its last. The tiny body shuddered with each exhale, and its eyes, which had briefly opened during the night, remained closed. Jack sat on his worn leather chair, the cub cradled in his lap. His hands, usually steady enough to capture perfect photographs in the most challenging conditions, trembled slightly as he stroked the cub's head. "Don't you dare," Jack whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare give up. You made it through the storm. You can make it through this." He'd seen death enough times in the wild to recognize its approach. The cub's eyes had glazed over, its tiny body surrendering to the inevitable. In the harsh morning light, Jack could see how truly frail the creature was. Perhaps 3 pounds at most, when it should have been nearly twice that weight. Its silver-gray fur, which would one day be thick and lustrous, was dull and sparse in places. In a final, desperate attempt, Jack lifted the cub against his chest, letting his heartbeat and body heat envelop the tiny creature. He remembered reading somewhere that orphaned animals sometimes simply lost the will to live, that beyond physical injuries, they needed the security and comfort of contact to survive. "Live," he commanded, his voice breaking. "Just live. I didn't drag you through that storm just to lose you now." Hours passed. Jack remained motionless, afraid the slightest movement would snuff out the fragile spark of life he cradled. The cabin grew cold as the fire died down, but he dared not move to add more logs. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him, and he drifted into uneasy sleep, his dreams filled with howling winds and accusing yellow eyes. He awoke to something warm and wet against his hand. For a moment, disoriented, he thought he'd spilled the formula. Then he felt it again, a small, deliberate movement. The cub, impossibly, was licking his fingers. Its eyes, though still weak, had regained focus. When Jack offered the formula again, the cub drank greedily, its tiny pink tongue working frantically at the soaked cloth. "Well, I'll be damned," Jack whispered, a smile breaking across his weathered face. "You're tougher than you look." For 3 days and nights, Jack barely left the cub's side. He fashioned a proper splint for the broken leg using materials from his extensive first aid kit, a necessity for someone living so far from medical care. He treated the various cuts and abrasions with antiseptic, wincing at the cub's pitiful whines when the solution stung. He fed the increasingly demanding patient every 2 hours, day and night, gradually increasing the formula's richness as the cub's digestion improved. Jack converted a large wooden storage box into a makeshift den, lining it with soft blankets and placing it near the fireplace. But more often than not, the cub ended up sleeping on Jack's chest or curled in the crook of his arm, seeking the comfort of heartbeat and warmth. The cub's transformation was remarkable. From death's door to alert and even playful in less than a week. Its eyes, which had been dull and unfocused, now tracked Jack's movements around the cabin with intelligent curiosity. The broken leg remained immobile in its splint, but the cub had adapted, scooting around on its belly when determined to follow Jack from room to room. On the 7th day, Jack introduced small pieces of softened meat into the diet, watching carefully for any digestive issues. The cub attacked the new food with such enthusiasm that Jack couldn't help laughing out loud, the sound startling in the quiet cabin where he'd lived alone for so long. "You're a fighter," Jack told the cub as it attempted to gnaw on his thumb with needle-sharp teeth. "I'll give you that. A real survivor." He gently extracted his finger from the cub's mouth, replacing it with an acceptable chew toy, a piece of soft leather from an old camera case. Jack found himself talking to the cub constantly, narrating his activities, sharing observations about the weather, even reading aloud from his dog-eared copy of Walden in the evenings. The one-sided conversations filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. "You need a name," Jack realized on the 10th day, watching the cub attempt to pounce on a shadow cast by the morning light. "Can't just keep calling you little guy forever." He considered and discarded several options. Traditional wolf names from mythology felt too pretentious. Cutesy names seemed inappropriate for a wild predator, even one currently rolling onto its back for a belly rub. Finally, inspiration struck as Jack watched the cub's silver-gray fur catch the light. "Shadow," he said decisively. The cub looked up, ears perked forward. "How's that? Simple, dignified, suits you." The cub yawned widely, pink tongue curling, before settling back to gnaw on its toy. "I'll take that as approval." But as Shadow grew stronger, Jack faced a decision that would put everything he'd worked for at risk. Wildlife rehabilitation was strictly regulated. Keeping a wolf, a protected species, without permits was illegal. The ethical path was clear. Contact authorities and surrender the cub to professionals who could properly prepare it for eventual release, or, if that proved impossible, place it in a certified sanctuary. Yet each time he reached for the phone, something stopped him. The way Shadow watched his every move with complete trust. How the cub curled against him at night, seeking his warmth. The strange, unexpected feeling of responsibility unlike anything he'd ever known. Just until you're stronger, Jack told himself, gently massaging the muscles around Shadow's healing leg. Just until spring, when food will be more plentiful and you'll have a better chance out there. But even as he said it, Jack knew he was crossing a line. The line between temporary care and something more permanent was already beginning to blur. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a warning voice reminded him that wolves were pack animals. Shadow might be dependent now, but what would happen when he grew into his wild heritage? And more importantly, what would happen when the wolf pack that had lost this cub eventually picked up his scent again? Jack pushed these thoughts aside as Shadow limped toward him, yellow eyes bright with what Jack could have sworn was affection. One day at a time, he decided. That was all anyone could do. By the end of the first month, Shadow had transformed from a fragile wisp of life into a bundle of perpetual motion. His splint came off, revealing a leg that, while slightly bowed, supported his weight without issue. His coat had filled in, glossy and thick, with distinctive markings emerging around his face. Dark patches above his eyes that gave him a perpetually inquisitive expression. "You're getting too big for your britches," Jack commented one morning when he found Shadow had somehow climbed onto the kitchen counter and knocked over a canister of coffee. The cabin, once meticulously organized, now bore all the hallmarks of living with a curious predator. Chewed table legs, scattered books, blankets arranged and rearranged into makeshift dens in unexpected corners. Jack had adapted his life completely around Shadow's care. He'd ordered specialized milk replacer, high-quality raw meat, and books on wolf behavior through his monthly supply drops. His contact in town, an old friend named Mike who ran the general store, asked no questions about the unusual orders, just raised an eyebrow and muttered something about hermits and their hobbies. The winter deepened, blanketing the mountains in snow that often reached the windowsills. Jack's photography work took a back seat as he focused on Shadow's development. Instead of trekking miles to capture the perfect shot of mountain goats or elk, he found himself photographing Shadow's daily discoveries. His first encounter with snow, initial suspicion followed by unbridled joy. His attempts to catch snowflakes, his puzzled reaction to ice. But raising a wolf cub presented challenges Jack hadn't anticipated. Shadow's teeth and claws grew sharper. Play sessions that had once been gentle now left Jack's arms scratched and nipped. The cub's strength increased exponentially, and his natural predatory instincts began to surface. "Easy, buddy." Jack winced one afternoon when Shadow's playbite broke skin. The cub immediately released his grip, yellow eyes widening at Jack's tone. "We need some ground rules here." Jack implemented a training regimen based on what he'd observed in wild wolf packs. Consistent boundaries, clear signals for acceptable behavior, redirecting predatory energy toward appropriate outlets. He fashioned tough toys from leather scraps and rope, designed to withstand Shadow's increasingly powerful jaws. Elena called periodically on the satellite phone, her initial disapproval gradually shifting to grudging support as Jack reported Shadow's progress. "You know you're going to have to make a decision soon," she reminded him during one call. "He's what, 14 weeks now? The window for successful reintroduction to the wild is closing." "I know," Jack replied, watching Shadow stalk a moth across the cabin floor, his movements already showing the fluid grace of a born hunter. "I'm working on it." But the truth was more complicated. Jack had begun researching wildlife sanctuaries, making discreet inquiries about facilities that might take Shadow. Each time he received information, however, he found reasons to delay. This sanctuary had too many wolves already. That one didn't have adequate space. Another used methods Jack disagreed with. The real reason remained unspoken, even to himself. He couldn't bear the thought of letting Shadow go. As winter slowly released its grip on the mountains, Jack faced another challenge. Shadow needed more space than the cabin could provide. The cub's boundless energy couldn't be contained within four walls, no matter how many enrichment activities Jack devised. With spring's first thaw, Jack began taking Shadow outside on a handmade leather lead. These excursions started as brief explorations of the immediate vicinity, but gradually extended farther into the surrounding forest. Shadow's reaction to the wider world was a joy to witness. Every scent, sound, and sight investigated with intense curiosity. "This is your real home," Jack told him, watching Shadow paw at a melting patch of snow. "Out here, not cooped up with an old photographer." During these outings, Jack observed Shadow's instincts emerging. The cub froze at the sound of a distant elk bugle. He tracked scents with growing precision. He practiced stalking techniques on unsuspecting squirrels and rabbits, rarely catching anything but improving with each attempt. It was during one such excursion, when Shadow was nearly 5 months old, that everything changed. They had ventured farther than usual, following a deer trail that wound through a stand of aspens just beginning to bud. Shadow trotted ahead, nose to the ground, occasionally looking back to ensure Jack was following. The spring air carried the scent of wet earth and new growth, and Jack had brought his camera along, hoping to capture some of the season's first wildflowers. Shadow suddenly froze, muscles tense, ears swiveling forward. Before Jack could react, the cub dropped into a low crouch, eyes fixed on something in the distance. Jack followed his gaze and felt his heart stop. There, watching them from a rocky outcrop about 50 yards away, was a full-grown gray wolf. Its silver coat blended with the lingering patches of snow, but its amber eyes were fixed unmistakably on Shadow. "Don't move," Jack whispered, though whether to Shadow or himself, he wasn't sure. Slowly, he reached for the cub's lead, which had been trailing loose on the ground. The adult wolf took a step forward, and Jack's breath caught. Then another wolf appeared beside the first, and another. Within moments, 5 adult wolves stood on the ridge, all watching the strange pair below them, the human and the wolf cub. Shadow whined softly, a sound Jack had never heard him make before. It wasn't fear, exactly, but recognition. Some primal part of him responding to his own kind. The largest wolf, presumably the alpha, took several deliberate steps down the slope. Jack's hand closed around the bear spray in his pocket, though he knew it would do little good against 5 wolves if they decided to attack. But attack wasn't what the wolf had in mind. It stopped about 20 yards away, head low but not aggressive, and let out a soft chuffing sound. Shadow responded immediately, pulling against the lead with such force that Jack nearly lost his grip. "Shadow, no!" Jack hissed, tightening his hold. The cub looked back at him, and Jack saw something new in those familiar yellow eyes. Conflict. For the first time, Shadow was torn between the man who had raised him and the call of his own kind. The standoff lasted perhaps 2 minutes, though it felt like hours to Jack. Finally, the alpha wolf turned and loped back to the pack. One by one, they disappeared over the ridge, their departure as silent as their arrival. Shadow watched them go, straining against the lead until the last tail vanished from sight. Then he sat on his haunches and let out a mournful howl, his first, that echoed through the valley. The walk back to the cabin was silent. Shadow followed without his usual enthusiasm, his gait subdued. Jack's mind raced with implications. The wolves hadn't been aggressive. They'd shown interest in Shadow, perhaps even recognition. Could they somehow know he was one of their own? A lost pack member? That night, Shadow was restless, pacing the cabin and pausing occasionally to look out the windows into the darkness. Jack sat at his desk, reviewing the photographs he'd managed to take of the wolf pack. They were magnificent animals, healthy and powerful, and unmistakably similar to Shadow in their markings. "Was that your family?" Jack asked softly as Shadow finally settled beside his chair. "Is that where you belong?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, but unavoidable. Jack had always known this day would come, the day when Shadow's true nature would assert itself, when the call of the wild would become too strong to ignore. He just hadn't expected it to happen so soon, or to feel so devastating. As Shadow finally drifted to sleep, Jack made a difficult decision. Tomorrow, he would contact Elena. It was time to discuss reintroduction options, proper ones with monitoring and support from wildlife officials. If that pack was Shadow's original family, perhaps there was a chance for him to rejoin them under supervised conditions. But as Jack finally crawled into bed, Shadow immediately jumping up to curl against him as always, he couldn't help wondering if he was already too late. Not just because of Shadow's age and human imprinting, but because of the bond they'd formed. A bond that had changed them both in ways neither wilderness nor civilization had prepared them for. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled. After a moment, another answered. Shadow's ears twitched in his sleep, but he didn't wake. Jack lay awake long into the night, listening to the distant conversation and the steady breathing of the wild creature who had somehow become the center of his world. Elena arrived 3 days later, her ancient Jeep grinding up the muddy access road with determined persistence. Jack watched from the porch, Shadow at his feet, as she navigated the final stretch and parked beside his truck. Her expression, as she stepped out and spotted the wolf cub, was unreadable. "He's bigger than I expected," she said by way of greeting, adjusting her glasses. At 45, Elena Ramirez was a compact woman with streaks of premature gray in her dark hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of her life outdoors. Her reputation in wildlife conservation circles was formidable. Tough but fair, pragmatic but passionate. Shadow regarded the newcomer warily, pressing against Jack's leg. "Shadow, this is Elena," Jack said quietly. "She's here to help." Elena raised an eyebrow. "You named him." It wasn't a question, but Jack felt the need to defend himself anyway. Seemed better than "Hey, you." "Names create attachment," Elena replied, setting down her equipment bag. "For both parties." She crouched, holding out her hand palm down for Shadow to investigate. The cub sniffed cautiously, then retreated back to Jack. "At least you didn't try to make him into a pet. He's still got healthy caution around strangers." Inside the cabin, Elena conducted a thorough examination while Jack prepared coffee. Shadow tolerated her prodding with surprising patience, though he kept his eyes fixed on Jack the entire time. "Physically, he's in excellent condition," Elena concluded, packing away her stethoscope. "The leg healed well. Nutrition is good, maybe a bit too good. Wild wolves don't get premium beef every day." She accepted the mug Jack offered. "But physically isn't the issue here." Jack sat across from her at the kitchen table. "You saw the photos I sent. That pack could be his original family, yes. The markings are consistent with a highline pack that ranges in this area. But Jack," she leaned forward, "even if they are his relatives, reintroduction at this stage is complicated. He's formed primary bonds with a human. He's habituated to human presence, human shelter, human food. He hunts, Jack countered. Small game, but he's getting better. And you saw how he responded when we encountered the pack. With interest, yes. But he stayed with you. Elena took a sip of coffee. Look, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would require a structured reintroduction program. Gradual withdrawal of human contact, controlled exposure to the pack under supervision, possibly months of work, and even then, success isn't guaranteed. Shadow had settled at Jack's feet, seemingly asleep but with one ear constantly turned toward the conversation. What's the alternative? Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. A wildlife sanctuary. I've made some calls. Wolf Haven in Washington might have space. They have excellent facilities, professional staff. He'd be safe there. Safe in an enclosure. Forever. Jack couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. Elena's expression softened. I know this is hard. You've done something remarkable, Jack. You saved him when no one else would have bothered. But now you need to do the next right thing for him, whatever that is. They spent the afternoon reviewing options, weighing pros and cons of various approaches. Elena made calls on the satellite phone, consulting colleagues about reintroduction protocols. Jack showed her the areas where he'd spotted the wolf pack, marking locations on topographic maps spread across the table. As dusk fell, they reached a tentative plan. They would attempt a modified reintroduction using a soft release approach. A temporary enclosure would be built near the territory of the Highline pack. Shadow would live there while gradually being weaned from human contact. Wildlife officials would monitor the pack's response. If they showed interest without aggression, controlled interactions might be possible. It's still a long shot, Elena warned as they finished the last of a simple dinner. And you'll need to prepare yourself for the possibility that it won't work. Jack nodded, watching Shadow gnaw contentedly on a bone by the fireplace. How soon would we start? I can have a team here within 2 weeks to build the enclosure. After that? She hesitated. After that? You shouldn't visit him, Jack. That's the hardest part of this process. Your presence will only confuse him and hinder his reintegration. The words hit Jack like a physical blow, though he'd known they were coming. 2 weeks. 14 days left with Shadow, after 5 months of constant companionship. I understand, he said, his voice rough. That night, after Elena had retired to the spare room, Jack sat on the porch despite the chill. Shadow lounged beside him, occasionally raising his head to sample the night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, the mountains dark silhouettes against the sky. We always knew you weren't mine to keep, Jack told the wolf quietly. I was just borrowing you for a while. The next 2 weeks passed with brutal swiftness. Elena returned to town to coordinate with wildlife officials and arrange for construction of the enclosure. Jack took Shadow on longer excursions each day, venturing deeper into the wilderness, teaching him to hunt more effectively, encouraging his natural behaviors. They encountered the wolf pack twice more. Each time, the wolves observed from a distance, neither approaching nor fleeing. Shadow's reactions grew more animated, whining, pacing, even attempting to approach before Jack called him back. That's promising, Elena said when Jack reported these interactions. They're showing interest without aggression. That's our best-case scenario. The construction crew arrived. 4 men and women from the wildlife department who treated the project with professional efficiency. The enclosure took shape in a clearing about 2 miles from Jack's cabin, a half-acre space surrounded by sturdy fencing with a small shelter inside. It was designed to protect Shadow from other predators while allowing the local wolf pack to become accustomed to his presence. On the final evening before the transfer, Jack took Shadow to their favorite spot, a high ridge overlooking the valley. The spring sunset painted the landscape in gold and crimson. Shadow explored the familiar area with his usual enthusiasm, occasionally returning to check on Jack. "Tomorrow's the big day," Jack told him, scratching behind his ears. "New adventures for you." That night, Shadow slept on Jack's bed, rather than in his usual spot by the fireplace. Jack lay awake for hours, memorizing the weight and warmth of the wolf against his side, the rhythm of his breathing, the occasional twitch of his paws as he chased dream rabbits. Morning came too soon. Elena arrived with 2 wildlife officers and a transport crate. Shadow, sensing something unusual, stayed close to Jack, eyeing the strangers with suspicion. "We'll sedate him lightly for the transfer," Elena explained, preparing a syringe. "It's easier on everyone." Jack nodded, unable to speak. He knelt beside Shadow, holding him steady as Elena administered the injection. The wolf's eyes, fixed trustingly on Jack's face, gradually grew heavy. Within minutes, he was drowsy but conscious. His reactions slowed. Together, they lifted Shadow into the crate. Jack placed a worn blanket, one that smelled of both of them, inside with him. The cub settled on it immediately, still watching Jack through the bars. "You can ride with us to the enclosure," Elena said gently. The journey took only 20 minutes by ATV, but to Jack, it stretched into eternity. At the enclosure, they carried the crate inside and opened the door. Shadow emerged cautiously, sniffing the new surroundings. The sedation was wearing off, his movements becoming more coordinated. "This is where I leave you, buddy," Jack said, his voice barely steady. He knelt one last time, and Shadow came to him, pressing his head against Jack's chest in a familiar gesture. Jack allowed himself one final embrace, fingers sinking into the thick fur before standing abruptly. "We should go," Elena said softly. "The longer you stay, the harder it gets." Jack nodded, unable to trust his voice. He turned and walked away without looking back, though every step felt like walking through quicksand. The sound of Shadow's confused whine as they closed the enclosure gate would haunt him for months to come. Back at the cabin, the silence was deafening. Jack moved mechanically through his evening routine, constantly catching himself listening for Shadow's movements, looking for him in his usual spots. The absence was a physical ache, a phantom limb he couldn't stop reaching for. "He'll be fine," Elena assured him before departing. "We'll monitor him daily. I'll keep you updated." Jack nodded, thanked her, and watched her drive away. Then he picked up his camera, neglected these past months, and headed into the wilderness. There was work to do, life to continue. Shadow had his path now, and Jack had his. But as he hiked familiar trails, the forest seemed emptier somehow. The photographs he took that day were technically perfect, but lacked the spark that had once defined his work. Something essential had changed, not just in his cabin or his routine, but in himself. That night, a storm rolled in, rain lashing against the windows. Jack lay awake, wondering if Shadow was dry in his new shelter, if he was frightened by the thunder. Around midnight, between thunderclaps, he heard it. A long, mournful howl carrying through the darkness. Then another, answering from farther away. Jack stood by the window, listening as the howls continued, a conversation between the wild pack and the newcomer on their borders. In that haunting chorus, he found a strange comfort. Whatever happened next, Shadow wasn't alone. Neither of them was. Summer arrived in the mountains with explosive green growth and long golden evenings. Jack settled back into his work with determined focus, spending weeks tracking elk migrations, photographing bear cubs learning to forage, and documenting the delicate dance of mountain ecosystems recovering from winter's grip. His photographs from this period would later be described by critics as his most powerful work. Raw, intimate portraits of wilderness that somehow captured both the majesty and vulnerability of wild places. What the critics didn't know was that each image was taken within a 5-mile radius of Shadow's enclosure. Elena's updates came weekly. Shadow was adapting well to his new environment. He'd become more self-sufficient, hunting small prey that entered his enclosure and showing increasing interest in the wild pack that regularly patrolled the boundaries. The wildlife team had begun the next phase, occasionally opening the enclosure gate at night, allowing Shadow the freedom to explore while tracking his movements with a newly fitted radio collar. "He always returns by morning," Elena reported during one of her visits to the cabin. "That's both good and concerning. Good because it means he's not panicking or running off. Concerning because he's still treating the enclosure as home base." Jack nodded, studying the maps where they'd marked Shadow's nightly explorations. The circles grew wider each week, but always looped back to the enclosure. "And the pack?" he asked, the question he always came back to. Cautious but curious. The alpha female has been observed watching him from the ridgeline. No aggressive encounters so far. Elena hesitated. "There's something else you should know. We've confirmed this is definitely his natal pack. DNA analysis from scat samples matches. He's likely the offspring of the alpha pair." Jack absorbed this information with mixed emotions. Confirmation that Shadow had a family waiting should have been unequivocally good news. Instead, it complicated the already tangled threads of hope and loss he'd been trying to unravel. "That improves his chances, right?" he finally asked. "Theoretically. Wolf packs have been known to reaccept members after separation, especially young ones. But his human imprinting remains the wild card." As July stretched into August, Shadow's nighttime explorations grew longer. Twice, he stayed away for a full day before returning. The wildlife team reported increasing interactions with the wild pack, distant at first, then closer. Shadow and the younger wolves would sometimes play chase along the boundaries, though always with the caution of strangers. Jack kept his promise to stay away, though it cost him daily. Instead, he channeled his energy into a new project, documenting the Highline pack itself. Using blinds and his most powerful telephoto lenses, he captured the wolves hunting, playing, napping in dappled forest light. Through his viewfinder, he glimpsed the world Shadow might soon join. The alpha female fascinated him most. Silver-gray like Shadow, with the same distinctive facial markings, she moved with regal confidence. In her eyes, Jack sometimes caught a watchful intelligence that reminded him painfully of Shadow. "Could she be his mother?" he asked Elena, showing her the photographs. "Possible. The age and markings fit. Wolves are excellent parents, and they remember their offspring." She studied one image closely. The fact that she's taking such interest in the enclosure area supports that theory. By late August, Shadow had grown into a magnificent yearling, his puppy softness replaced by the leaner, more powerful build of a young adult wolf. His nighttime excursions now regularly included interactions with the pack, though he still returned to the enclosure most mornings. Then, on a clear September night, everything changed. Jack was awakened by Elena's call just after dawn. "Shadow didn't return to the enclosure last night," she said without preamble. "The tracking collar shows he's moved deeper into the pack's territory." Jack sat up, instantly alert. "Is he in trouble?" "We don't think so. The movement patterns suggest he's traveling with the pack, not running from them." "This could be it, Jack. the integration we've been hoping for. For 3 days, Shadow remained with the wild wolves. The tracking data showed him moving with the pack's hunting patterns, resting at their preferred sites. The wildlife team maintained their distance, observing only through spotting scopes from ridges far away. On the 4th morning, Jack's satellite phone rang again. "He's back at the enclosure," Elena said, her voice puzzled. "Came in just before dawn, looking exhausted but uninjured. It's like he needed a break from wild living." This pattern continued through September, Shadow spending increasingly longer periods with the pack before returning to the enclosure for brief respites. The wildlife team began discussing the next phase, removing the enclosure entirely, forcing Shadow to commit fully to wild living. Jack resisted. "He's making progress at his own pace. Why rush it?" "Because winter's coming," Elena explained patiently. "If he's going to survive with the pack, he needs to be fully integrated before the hard months hit. The enclosure is a crutch he needs to outgrow." She was right, of course. Jack knew it even as he argued against it. The mountains were already showing the first hints of autumn. Soon, the brutal winter would return, testing every creature's will to survive. The decision was made. In early October, when Shadow next left to join the pack, the wildlife team would dismantle the enclosure. His safety net would be gone when he next returned, forcing him to commit fully to wild living. Jack threw himself into work, spending 16-hour days in the field, exhausting himself to the point where sleep came without dreams. He ventured farther from his usual territory, as if physical distance might somehow ease the impending emotional separation. On a crisp October morning, Elena called with news he'd been both dreading and hoping for. "It's done," she said simply. "Shadow left 3 days ago to join the pack. The team removed the enclosure yesterday. He's officially wild now." Jack closed his eyes, letting the finality of it wash over him. "How's he doing?" "The collar data shows normal movement patterns. He appears to be fully integrated with the pack now. They're moving toward their winter hunting grounds in the Eastern Valley." After the call ended, Jack sat on his porch for a long time, watching golden aspen leaves spiral down in the breeze. The ending he'd hoped for had arrived. Shadow was where he belonged, with his own kind, living the life nature had intended before fate and a snowstorm intervened. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like loss. Winter descended on the mountains with its usual implacable force. Jack's days fell into familiar rhythms, photographing winter, wildlife, writing, maintaining his equipment. The satellite tracking updates continued monthly. Shadow was thriving with the pack, his movements showing full participation in hunts and territory defense. On the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, Jack hiked to the ridge where he'd often taken Shadow. The stars blazed overhead in the crystal-clear mountain air, and the snow-covered landscape glowed with ghostly blue light. In the distance, he heard wolves howling, the Highline pack announcing their presence to the night. Jack stood motionless, listening to the wild chorus. There was no way to know if Shadow's voice was among them, but he liked to think it was. Strong and confident, fully part of the ancient song. As he turned to head back to his cabin, movement caught his eye. A lone figure stood on the opposite ridge, silhouetted against the snow. Even at this distance, Jack recognized the distinctive profile of a wolf. He raised his binoculars slowly, hardly daring to breathe. The wolf was gray, with familiar markings around the face. Around its neck was the faint outline of a tracking collar. "Shadow," Jack whispered, the name fogging in the frigid air. The wolf's ears swiveled forward. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the divide. Man and wolf, separated by distance and destiny, yet connected by something neither wilderness nor civilization could fully explain. Then Shadow lifted his head and howled. A single, powerful note that echoed across the valley. Without waiting for response, he turned and loped away, disappearing into the forest like a ghost. Jack remained on the ridge until his fingers grew numb and his cheeks burned with cold. He knew, with absolute certainty, that Shadow hadn't been there by accident. The young wolf had come to the one place they'd shared most often, perhaps drawn by memory, perhaps by something deeper. It would be their last meeting. Jack understood this without being told, just as he understood that Shadow's return to the wild had been the only right ending to their story. The young wolf had two lives now, the one he was born to, and the one Jack had helped him reclaim. Both were part of him, neither diminishing the other. As Jack made his way back to his cabin through knee-deep snow, he felt something shift within him. Not the lifting of grief, exactly, but its transformation into something else. Something that acknowledged loss while honoring what remained. In the months and years that followed, Jack's photographs of wolves would earn him international recognition. Critics would note the unusual intimacy of his images, the way they seemed to capture not just the physical presence of the animals, but something of their essential nature. Jack never explained how he'd gained such insight. Some stories weren't meant to be shared. The Highline Pack thrived under the protection of the wildlife preserve eventually established in the region, due in no small part to Jack's advocacy and the stunning images that had captured public imagination. Shadow, identified by his collar until it eventually failed, rose to become a beta male within the pack, known for his unusual boldness around human researchers. Sometimes, on winter nights, when the wind carried from the east, Jack would hear wolves howling in the distance. He never knew if Shadow was among them, but it didn't matter. The howls themselves were enough. A reminder that some bonds transcend the boundaries we create between wild and tame, between letting go and holding on. In saving Shadow, Jack had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. And in returning Shadow to the wild, he discovered that some forms of love are measured not by what we keep, but by what we set free. 5 years passed. The mountains cycled through seasons of abundance and scarcity, each winter writing its own story in snow and survival, each spring erasing the harshest memories with new growth. Jack's life settled into a rhythm dictated by the wilderness he documented, his reputation as a wildlife photographer growing with each powerful collection he published. Shadows of the Wild, his book featuring the Highline Pack, had become a cornerstone of conservation efforts throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The images, intimate, revealing moments of wolf society rarely witnessed by human eyes, had changed public perception in ways scientific papers never could. People who had once viewed wolves as menacing predators now saw their complex social bonds, their playfulness, their essential role in healthy ecosystems. Jack never explicitly mentioned Shadow in the book, though the young wolf's journey had inspired the entire project. Some stories belonged to the land and sky alone. On a crisp autumn morning in the 5th year after Shadow's return to the wild, Jack was photographing elk in a high meadow when his satellite phone buzzed. Few people had that number, and fewer still used it except in emergencies. "Jack Winters," he answered, voice rough from disuse. He'd been alone in the backcountry for nearly 2 weeks. "Jack, it's Elena." Her voice carried the professional calm he'd come to recognize as her way of delivering difficult news. "I thought you should know. We've lost contact with the Highline Pack." Jack lowered his camera, suddenly alert. What happened? Not entirely clear. The pack moved beyond their usual territory about 3 weeks ago. The last collar signals came from the northern boundary, then nothing. Could be equipment failure, but all 4 collared wolves going dark simultaneously is concerning. Jack processed this information, gazing across the golden meadow where mist still clung to shadowed hollows. Poachers? Possibly. There have been reports of illegal hunting in that area, or they could have encountered another pack and been driven to new territory. We've got teams searching, but I wanted you to hear it from me. After ending the call, Jack packed his gear with mechanical efficiency. The elk photography would have to wait. He had maps to study, contacts to call. The Highline pack had become more than subjects to him. They were Shadow's family, and by extension, connected to him in ways that defied simple explanation. Back at his cabin, Jack spread topographic maps across his table, marking the last known locations Elena had provided. The northern boundary pushed against a patchwork of private lands, some protected by conservation easements, others owned by ranchers or timber interests. If the pack had ventured into those territories, they might have encountered human hostility. For 2 days, Jack made calls, pulling in favors from ranger friends and fellow conservationists. No one had solid information, though rumors circulated. Wolf sightings farther north than usual, reports of gunshots in remote areas, whispers of a new pack moving into the region. On the 3rd morning, Jack loaded his truck with camping gear and headed north. If official channels couldn't locate the Highline pack, he would try unofficial ones. He knew the wolves' habits, their preferred hunting grounds, the routes they typically traveled. And he knew Shadow, knew the distinctive way he moved, the territories he favored. The search took him deep into unfamiliar country, beyond his usual range. Jack camped in remote valleys, hiked ridgelines at dawn and dusk when wolves were most active, and spoke with isolated homesteaders who viewed his questions with suspicion until they recognized his name from his books. Saw a wolf sign over by Buckhorn Creek last week, one elderly rancher offered, pointing to a remote drainage on Jack's map. Big pack by the look of the tracks. Didn't bother my cattle none, just passed through. Jack followed each lead, each faint trail. He found paw prints, scat, the remains of elk kills that showed the distinctive feeding patterns of wolves. But no direct sightings, no howls in the night to confirm the Highline pack's presence. A week into his search, a late autumn storm swept through the mountains, dropping 8 inches of snow overnight. Jack woke to a transformed landscape, every branch outlined in white, every rock and hollow softened by fresh powder. Perfect tracking conditions. He broke camp before sunrise and headed toward a high pass where game trails converged. The newly fallen snow recorded every creature's passage with pristine clarity. Jack moved slowly, reading the night's activities in tracks and disturbances. Deer moving downslope, a fox hunting mice, the distinctive hopping pattern of a snowshoe hare. Near the crest of the pass, he found what he'd been searching for. Wolf tracks, at least 6 individuals moving together along the ridgeline. The prints were fresh, made since the snowfall ended just before dawn. Jack followed, moving as quietly as his bulky winter gear allowed. The tracks led north for nearly 2 miles before descending into a sheltered valley he'd never explored. Here, the wolves' path became more purposeful, less meandering. They were heading somewhere specific. The valley narrowed, then opened into a broad basin surrounded by steep slopes. Jack paused at the tree line, scanning the open area with his binoculars. At first, he saw nothing but unbroken snow. Then movement caught his eye, a flash of gray against white, then another. Wolves, at least 8 of them, moving across the far side of the basin. Jack set up his camera with the longest telephoto lens he carried, his hands steady despite the surge of adrenaline. Through the viewfinder, he studied each animal, looking for familiar markings, for Shadow's distinctive profile. The pack moved with the coordinated precision that had always fascinated him. Not quite a formation, but a fluid arrangement where each member seemed aware of all others. They were heading toward a stand of trees where something dark lay in the snow. A recent kill, Jack guessed. He adjusted his focus, photographing each wolf as they came into clear view. There was the alpha female, instantly recognizable despite the years. Older now, but still regal in her bearing. Beside her trotted a massive male Jack didn't recognize. A new alpha, perhaps. Then younger wolves, including what appeared to be last spring's pups, nearly grown. Jack's breath caught as another wolf emerged from the trees. Larger than most, with distinctive facial markings and a slight, almost imperceptible limp in his left hind leg. Shadow. The years had transformed the cub Jack had rescued into a powerful adult wolf in his prime. Even at this distance, Jack could see the confidence in his movements, his established place within the pack hierarchy, not an alpha, but a respected member, what biologists would call a beta male. Jack photographed continuously, documenting the pack's feeding patterns, their interactions, the subtle communications of posture and expression. They showed no awareness of his presence, focused entirely on their meal and each other. As the light began to fade, Jack reluctantly packed his equipment. He had what he needed, confirmation that the Highline pack was alive and well, just relocated to new territory. The scientific data would come from his photographs, number of individuals, health assessment, presence of pups indicating successful breeding. But he had something more valuable than data. He had seen Shadow thriving in the life he was meant to live, fully wild, yet carrying within him the brief chapter they had shared. Jack made his way back to his campsite in deepening twilight. As darkness fell completely, the temperature plummeted, stars emerging in a sky so clear it seemed they might shatter like ice crystals at a sound. That sound came as Jack was building his fire. A howl rising from the direction of the basin, then another joining it, and another, until the night vibrated with the pack's chorus. Jack stood motionless, listening to the complex harmonies of the wolves, calling to the night, to each other, to something humans could sense, but never fully comprehend. Among the voices, one stood out to Jack's attuned ear, slightly deeper, with a distinctive catch at the end of each phrase. Shadow's voice, as unmistakable as a human's laugh or cry. Jack slept that night, wrapped in his warmest sleeping bag. The wolf chorus eventually fading as the pack moved on to new hunting grounds. In the morning, he found fresh tracks circling his campsite. At least one wolf had investigated during the night, approaching within 20 feet of where he slept before rejoining the others. The tracks were large, the stride long and confident. Jack didn't need to measure them to know who had paid the visit. He returned to his cabin 2 days later and immediately called Elena with his findings. "That's extraordinary," she said when he described the new territory and the pack's apparent good health. "We'll redirect our search efforts based on your coordinates. And Shadow, you're certain it was him?" "Without question," Jack replied. "The leg healed well, but he still has that slight hitch in his stride when he's running. And the facial markings are distinctive. I'll need copies of your photographs for the official record." "Of course, I'll send them over." Jack hesitated. "There's something else. One of them visited my campsite during the night, came right up to where I was sleeping, then left." Elena was silent for a moment. "That's concerning, Jack. A wild wolf approaching a human camp. that closely suggests habituation. It was Shadow, Jack said quietly. And he didn't approach out of habituation or looking for food. He knew exactly who was there. Jack, her tone held warning. Be careful about anthropomorphizing. Even with your history, Shadow is a wild animal now. He's been living with the pack for 5 years. I know what he is, Jack replied. And I know what I saw. After sending Elena the photographs and his detailed observations, Jack returned to his regular work. The knowledge that the Highline Pack and Shadow were thriving in their new territory brought a sense of completion to a chapter he'd never quite closed. Winter settled over the mountains. Jack spent the darkest months organizing his vast photo archive and working on his next book, a broader study of predator-prey relationships throughout the Rocky Mountain ecosystem. Shadow and the Highline Pack featured prominently, though Jack maintained his silence about his personal connection to the wolves. In late January, during a rare trip to town for supplies, Jack received an unexpected message from Elena. The Wildlife Department had approved a new research initiative focused on wolf communication and pack dynamics. They wanted Jack's participation as both photographer and consultant, based on his unparalleled documentation of the Highline Pack. We'll be placing new, advanced tracking collars on several pack members, Elena explained when they met to discuss the project. The technology allows us to record not just location data, but vocalizations, heart rate, even basic indicators of emotional state. Jack frowned. Sounds invasive. Less than you might think. The collars are lighter with longer battery life, and the data could revolutionize our understanding of how wolves communicate, how they make group decisions. She slid a folder across the table. We want to focus particularly on Shadow. His unique history makes him especially valuable to the study. Jack leafed through the proposal, conflicted. The scientist in him recognized the research value. The man who had raised a wolf cub felt protective of Shadow's hard-won freedom. I'll consider it, he said finally. The decision came to him not in the form of logical analysis, but as a dream. In it, he stood on a mountain ridge, camera in hand, while Shadow approached across a snowfield. The wolf carried something in his mouth, not prey, but an object Jack couldn't quite identify. When Shadow reached him, he dropped it at Jack's feet, a collar, broken and discarded. Jack woke with absolute clarity. He called Elena that morning. I'll help with the project on one condition, he told her. Shadow remains uncollared. Study the others, but let him be completely free. Elena's silence spoke volumes. That's not really how research protocols work, Jack. We can't make exceptions based on sentiment. It's not sentiment, it's respect. He's earned the right to live without our technology hanging around his neck. The rest of the pack will provide plenty of data. The negotiation continued for weeks. Jack leveraged his participation and the valuable publicity his name would bring to the project, against Shadow's freedom. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Shadow would receive a collar, but one designed to detach automatically after 6 months, half the duration planned for the others. Spring arrived as Jack and the research team began their work, tracking the Highline Pack through their new territory. The collar placement required capturing each target wolf briefly, a process that involved specialized traps, tranquilizers, and quick, efficient handling to minimize stress. Jack insisted on being present when they captured Shadow. The wolf was in his prime, magnificent and healthy, his coat thick and glossy. Under sedation, he showed no recognition of Jack, of course. But Jack spoke to him anyway, as the technicians fitted the new collar. Just a little longer, buddy, he murmured, close to the wolf's ear. "Then you're free for good." The research project yielded fascinating insights into wolf society. The recordings captured complex vocalizations that suggested a much more sophisticated communication system than previously documented. The Highline Pack's hunting strategies, territorial defense, and care of young all became subjects of scientific papers that would influence wolf management for years to come. Jack's photographs and observations formed the heart of this work. He spent months in the field, documenting the pack's activities through seasonal changes. Though he maintained professional distance, never attempting to approach Shadow directly, he occasionally found signs that the connection remained. Tracks circling his remote campsites, a lone howl at dawn when the rest of the pack was silent. 6 months into the project, Shadow's collar was scheduled to detach. The mechanism was triggered remotely, designed to release without disturbing the wolf. Jack was photographing from a blind nearly a mile away when Elena confirmed the signal. "It's done," she said over the radio. "Shadow is officially collar-free." That evening, as Jack made his way back to his truck, he found wolf tracks on the trail, a single animal moving purposefully in the same direction. He followed them with his flashlight until they veered off into dense forest. At his truck, Jack found something unexpected. A small, dark object placed precisely in the center of the driver's seat, visible through the window he'd left partially open for ventilation. He opened the door cautiously. It was Shadow's collar, the release mechanism clearly triggered, the electronic components still blinking faintly. Jack stood motionless, scanning the surrounding forest. Nothing moved in the gathering darkness, but he felt the weight of eyes watching from somewhere among the trees. "You're welcome," he said softly to the silent forest. The research project continued for another year, yielding groundbreaking data on wolf behavior. Jack's book on the Highline Pack, published the following winter, became his most acclaimed work. A perfect marriage of art and science that changed how people viewed these essential predators. Shadow remained collar-free, though the research team occasionally recorded his distinctive howl on the equipment carried by his packmates. He rose eventually to alpha status after the original male was injured in a territorial dispute, leading the Highline Pack with the same quiet confidence he'd shown since youth. Jack continued his work, documenting the changing mountain ecosystems, advocating for wildlife protection, teaching younger photographers his meticulous techniques. But he always returned to the wolves, to the Highline Pack, to the connection that had transformed his understanding of wildness and belonging. 10 years after the snowy night when he'd carried a dying wolf cub into his cabin, Jack hiked to the ridge they had often visited together. The mountains were painted in autumn gold, the air crisp with the promise of coming winter. He set up his camera more from habit than intention, watching the valley below through his viewfinder. Movement caught his eye. Wolves emerging from the forest edge, moving with practiced coordination toward a distant elk herd. Jack recognized the Highline Pack immediately. Though its membership had changed over the years as wolves died or dispersed, as new pups were born and matured. At their head moved a large male, silver-gray with distinctive facial markings. Older now, with hints of white around his muzzle, but still powerful, still unmistakably Shadow. Jack photographed the hunt with professional detachment, documenting each phase of the pack's strategy. They moved like water across the landscape, separating, rejoining, communicating through posture and movement, too subtle for human eyes to fully comprehend. As the light faded, Jack packed his equipment. He had what he needed, another chapter in the ongoing story of the Highline Pack, another glimpse into the life Shadow had built in the wilderness. He was halfway down the trail when he heard it, a single howl rising from the ridge behind him. Jack stopped, listening as the lone voice held its note against the darkening sky. No other wolves answered. This wasn't a rally call or a territorial announcement. It was something else entirely. Jack stood motionless until the howl faded into silence. He didn't turn back, didn't try to catch one last glimpse. Some moments weren't meant to be captured, even by the most skilled photographer. Some were meant only to be heard, to be felt, to be carried forward like a story passed down through generations, a story about a man, a wolf, and the wild place where their lives had briefly, improbably intersected. A story with no ending, only transformation.